Face jugs are a remarkable form of ceramic art in American history. In them lies such rich historical evidence of both our tragic past and of the triumph of humanity. They really are remarkable objects, registering for us one of the most difficult passages in our country's history, and the way the human spirit will triumph in the most difficult of times. So there is a bit of a hidden legacy, and we'll discover how and why this legacy might have been hidden, of these enslaved craftsmen, the Africans kidnapped from the western coast of Africa and brought in against embargoes in the mid-1800s. Ended up, some of them, settling in the Edgefield district of South Carolina. And that's what we'll be looking at, is how these imported kidnapped Africans were put into indentured servitude and then led to the creation of some face jugs when some of them began to work directly with Southern craftsmen. Here's a face jug from that period, from the Edgefield district of South Carolina. Estimated time of creation between 1855 and 1865. They're alkaline glazed stoneware. And the interesting thing about them is that they appear much larger, but most of them are just under 6 inches tall, as is the case with this one. And they had a multitude of functions, both from the functional aspects of transporting alcohol or water to both religious and spiritual functions. So in this period of time, these were the most recognizable of Southern pottery forms. This Edgefield face vessel. Beginning in the 1850s, these alkaline glazed stoneware objects were reportedly made by African-American potters. And we should really emphasize that word reportedly and try to understand how obscured the history has become and why. So they were working in Edgefield districts, had a vast network of potteries, and so which most of the production of these potteries were standard items of the time. Utilitarian jars, jugs, and churns, all used and depended upon for food, transportation, and storage and production. The face vessels are relatively scarce by comparison. The history of the production and use of these objects is still shrouded in mystery and controversy. They were finally turned on potter's wheels, and their facial features were hand sculpted and applied. Ceramic scholars have put forth several working theories as to their original purposes, including that these vessels are the remnants of African religious or spiritual rituals. And we'll make the case for that theory. But the shrouded in mystery and controversy is really kind of an intriguing situation with these ceramic objects, because there's plenty of history written in the time. They just didn't write about these because they were the production of enslaved peoples who weren't really often considered people, but more possessions. And so history often overlooked their work, their experiences, and their accomplishments. But in the midst of all of this tragedy and struggle, they produced these really wonderful animated vases, and we'll take a look at some of those reasons. Here's an example, and shows a lot of the characteristics. This, again, just under 6 inches tall, and it shows you the eyes and the teeth are made from a white kaolin clay. And then when the glazing is done, the care is taken not to glaze over the white clay so that the color contrast remains strong. You can see this, again, example from the Edgefield County in South Carolina. And you'll see several views here of this piece. And you can also see the vigor, directness, and almost simple application of the facial features here. The artists applying the clay directly to thrown vessels. And you'll see a variety of different ears and noses and mouths, eyes, all in this process, but they do all kind of share a common sort of directness and kind of a primal quality, just a direct illustrative approach that isn't necessarily naturalistic or realistic, but symbolic of facial features. So this is where all that shrouded in mystery and controversy comes from. They were created in a conversation between enslaved black and free white craftsmen working side by side across the southern landscape. Over the past 30 years, researchers at MESDA have identified nearly 6,500 craftsmen who enslaved people. So during this period in the mid-1800s, over 6,500 craftsmen owned slaves. This fact is among the most common things known about an identified craftsman. So often anonymous, those who were enslaved by craftsmen were often at work on building sites, at the potter's wheels and cabinet shops, at iron foundries, behind the counters of silversmith shops, and at dozens of other trades. Their skills are revealed in the objects that they help to fashion. Their identities are often lost to history because history just wasn't looking. They just weren't looking at these peoples who were kidnapped and put into slavery. A line in a legal document or a brief mention in an advertisement is often all we know about the enslaved craftsman, but careful reading of period documents by MESDA researchers has identified nearly 3,000 enslaved craftsmen by name. The exhibition, Black and White All Mixed Together, The Hidden Legacy of Enslaved Craftsmen, looks at the icons of Southern decorative arts through the lens of research conducted by MESDA over more than 30 years. It recovers the stories of many named and nameless individuals whose hidden hands shaped the Southern landscape. This exhibition was on view at MESDA from April 2008 to September 2008. MESDA is the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. So here we see another example of a face jug, and one of the construction problems that arises in this methodology, and which you may learn or experience as well, the pots are thrown and then allowed to stiffen a little bit, to dry just a little bit to support the transformation as clay is added to make the eyes and nose and mouth and ears. But in this example, you can see that the pot that these features were applied to was clearly a little drier than normal, and so the clay began to pull away because the features were applied with wet clay onto already partially dried the pottery form, and so the shrinkage was not matched, and so some cracking is seen around the nose, the ears, the handle. All of this can be evidenced as you look at this wonderful piece. More than 100 small face jugs have been recorded, but only 10 face cups, an example of which is included here, are known. In the late 19th century, the face jug became a whimsical addition for many southern white potters working in Georgia and North and South Carolina, and no longer retained its original meaning. So what that's really saying is kind of like the emergence of the blues and jazz music. So much came from the introduction of African culture to America, and as it grew and emerged and attracted interest and caught the interest and passion of others, it began to cross racial lines and cultural lines and class lines, and so southern white potters began working in making face jugs, and they still do today. In fact, many of them are made both by white and African American potters today in that region, because they're a popular item for visitors to come and view and purchase. So here is another face jug. This is the one we were looking at, and you can see the cracking that I referred to. So this face jug again is looking, it's less than 6 inches tall, and they were initially made by slaves and later by free African Americans. In this source, they're actually saying that very clearly, both the made by slaves and later by African Americans that were given freedom. Early in Edgefield, face vessels were wheel turned from stoneware clay and then fired with alkaline glazes that range in color from sandy brown to olive green. The most distinctive feature of these objects is their highly expressive applied face, which typically includes wide open eyes, mouth, and bared teeth, idiosyncratic ears, noses, and eyebrows. On the earliest forms, the eyes and teeth are made from white kaolin clay, often left unglazed. The art historian Robert Ferris Thomas notes that the white eyes and teeth set against the glaze make the finest Afro-Carolinian face vessels appear to roar, where works 3 times their size merely whisper. And this is something that does occur as adopted by white potters capturing the interest of more and more tourists. What you find is that the size of the face jugs gets larger and larger. But what Robert Ferris Thompson is telling us is that these pieces, the original face jugs, have such an energy and a quality that they appear to really roar in their presence. They have a big, loud, monumental presence, where some of these larger forms seem timid by comparison. This next idea, nothing in Europe is remotely like them. For the use of kaolin insets into the body seems particular to the Afro-Carolinian and Carolinian and his imitators. This is a really important point made in this document, is that because there wasn't enough attention paid at the time and not enough documentation for us to say clearly and directly that these pieces were created by African American slaves. But what you see here is this statement that they had to be, and citing various things. And some scholars point out that both immigrant German and immigrant English potters working in the Carolinas were making figurative pottery in their native countries. In England and Germany, there was a tradition of figurative pottery. So that's a good point, and that's an important observation. But when you look at the actual pottery that was being made, it is in no way reminiscent of these vigorous, direct, simple faces that seem to be very reminiscent of African wooden sculptures called nkisis. So they're no way really similar to, say, an English Toby mug, which is actually quite naturalistic and realistic. So the case seems to be quite strong for that they were made by African American slaves. So here is one of the few mugs made during that period. Only 10 are known. So this one is about 4 1/4 inches tall and 5 1/4 inches from ear to ear. You can see the handle in the back here. This stoneware mug with light green alkaline glaze has a flaring short rim. Alkaline glaze is a mix of clay and ash or lime that acted as a flux. So a mixture of clay and ash, and sometimes lime. So the fluxing everything, turning it to glass. The strap handle was made by pulling or extruding a strip of clay, placing one end of the strip against the vessel, and then looping it out to make the handle shape. The mug has large protruding uneven ears applied to the sides of the cup, and nose and eyes and mouth applied opposite the handle. The eyes and teeth are of whiter clay. As with this mug, on the earlier forms, the eyes and teeth were made from white kaolin clay and were often left unglazed, creating distinct color difference between the browns and the greens of the alkaline glaze and the bright white of the kaolin clay. Here is that mug. And here are some later examples of the face jug idea. These are larger forms, and this is now in Arden, North Carolina, and here this one is really functioning as a kind of storefront sign, Graham's Furniture and Hardware store in Bakersville, North Carolina. Here's another kind of demon mug. This devil face jug is covered with an Albany slip, which is a dark, gives you this dark iron-rich, almost black-brown glaze. You can see the eyebrows and the mustache are very, very prominent, as well as the goatee. This is 11 5/8 inches tall. And it's early 20th century, so we're seeing this. This is much further along, and these pieces are no longer being made for the same reasons as the earlier mugs, or the earlier face jugs that were being made for lots of different reasons, for spiritual and religious reasons. Here's a close-up of the mustache and mouth with the kaolin clay teeth. A look at the bottom of the pot, the top of the pot. Here's an example where whatever was used for the eyes was melting at a lower temperature, whether it was a glass or it could have been a stone like a limestone or a feldspar stone, depending on how hot it was fired. Here's a piece that was most likely made much later than this, but probably around the mid-1800s than this date offered here. And this is a face jug attributed to Dave the Potter, who was active during this period and was one of the few slaves that was allowed to sign his work, and often he was literate, so he would write lines of poetry into his pots, and he threw some of the largest storage vessels of the time. This piece is 6.5 inches tall, and so he is one of the few African American potters known by name. This face jug, again from the Edgefield district in South Carolina. Again, the alkaline glaze. This is a brown version of that glaze. This is interesting. So you can get a sense of how the history of these things is kind of worked out. This was discovered by the plumber Robert Strang as in the 1950s in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, while digging a trench for the foundation and plumbing of the soon-to-be-built Leeds Middle School. The jug was buried at the site of a house that belonged to Leroy Stockton Wingate, who had 2 live-in servants from the Edgefield district, according to the 1930s U.S. Census. So they're finding this information out by reviewing the census. Lewis Gardner was Wingate's chauffeur, and Lewis's wife Leatha was his cook. A World War I draft card for Lewis Gardner stated that he was born in Edgefield, and genealogical records indicate that the Gardner's ancestors were slaves at the plantation of Colonel Thomas J. Davies, who was a pottery owner, and interviewed by Edwin Alty Barber in 1909. So this comes from Bible records from Thomas Jones Davis. So you can see we've got census, we've got World War I draft records, all these documents to find out who was where at what time, because there wasn't any records being kept concurrent with the creation of these vessels. What you're also seeing here, this big white or kind of light colored clay circle around the eye, is where the upper and lower lids of the piece were knocked off, broken off, not fully attached or strongly enough attached to survive the years. So that's what you see here on the left eye of the piece, your right. In 1858, 50 years after the importation of slaves was banned. So in 1808, the importation of slaves was banned in the United States, but still there was illegal trade, and a ship unloaded several hundred Africans on the Georgia coast. About 100 ended up in Edgefield area. These new arrivals may have started a revival of African religious practices that involved creating these figurative ceramics. And the African religious practices, in a lot of the sculpture, figurative sculpture in Africa, is believed to be animate. It is believed to be alive with the spirits of ancestors. And so these jugs may have very well performed that service of basically housing for ancestors' spirits. The exhibition shows that the face jugs, as being closely related to the Nkisi figures from the West and Central Africa. Nkisi and face jugs shared many physical characteristics: the white eyes, the prominently displayed, often pointed white teeth, the pure white clay kaolin used for eyes and teeth in the jugs is considered a sacred substance in Africa and was placed inside the Nkisi to activate its powers. And you can see here's a close-up of an Nkisi figure with nails hammered into it. And the nails were part of, these figures were vital to the cultural and practical life of the community. That if a person was trying to make a contract, this is a pre-literate culture, there's no writing. So if we want a contract for something, I'm going to do the gardening, I'm going to take care of the plants or your animals or something, and we agree to a certain amount you're going to pay me. That agreement is signed, is confirmed by each of us nailing a piece of metal into one of these figures. It's believed that ancestor spirits live in these figures, so that if you disagree, if you do not follow through with your obligations, then you would be visited by the ancestors that live in these spirits. So you would be in danger by these spirits. The figures are quite powerfully present and, I would say, somewhat intimidating. You can see the white eyes on the right. You can see the white teeth. You can also see the raised arm, which would normally hold a spear, which doesn't seem to have survived. And here's another figure. Each of them has a central place where sacred materials are put in, and power materials to empower the figures are placed in these central cavities in the pieces. And you can see this is a great example here. Again, the white eyes. And all kinds of materials being used. Here's a postcard that shows you several of the figures in a community, and you can see all the nails bristling over the surface. This is from Congo, the Congo village. So you can see when you look at this and you look at the Nkisi figures that the facial features are really quite strongly related, and could have been produced as these Africans were kidnapped and put into servitude, them seeing still a spiritual need for housing their ancestors, that they may have created these. Now you can already see here that this face jug is taking on a much more realistic quality, so I think this would be a much later than 1850 source for a face jug, and seems to show more of the European influence that you might see along the lines of a Toby jug. Here is another idea here. This is a place where the pots of the deceased are kept, and this is a tradition, an African tradition from Guyana, and you can see this idea that the pottery is a part of the funerary process. And it was true that these face jugs in South Carolina were used as on top of tombs, perhaps to ward off the evil eye, keep evil spirits from, protecting the deceased, the remains of the deceased from evil spirits. And you can see in the foreground of this photograph, you can see lots of ceramics with faces on them. Here's another face jug. and this is attributed to Ward Lee around 1880. It says unglazed stoneware, but there's clearly a white slip flaking off a bit on this surface to give it that white surface. Here is Ward Lee. Here's a photograph of Ward Lee, taken around 1900 from Edgefield County, South Carolina. Another face jug from the 1860 to 1880 period. So we're looking at a lot of these traditional face jugs. No more than a few hundred still exist from the original sources. Here's the signature of the potter who created it. So these were by slave potters at Thomas Davies Palmetto Fire Brickworks in Bath, South Carolina. These are face jugs created around 1862 to 1865. The empowerment of seemingly inanimate objects and the interconnectedness between the human world and the spirit world is the most important concept underlying this particular essay's revised interpretation of the Edgefield face jugs. So this idea that the African American slaves were finding something in order to house the spirits of their ancestors. And here is a fantastic California national treasure, recently deceased. On the top row here in the center is the wonderful, amazing Clayton Bailey. Great artist, a great ceramic artist, and he did a whole series of face jugs right out in Port Costa, and here are some of them. You can see how much he has enjoyed the invitation to turn the pottery form into a human head, and how he's played with the expressions and really created some wonderful imagery. And this is the other aspect of face jugs in contemporary times. They're still being made. They're being made by this class, they're being made by me, they're being made by artists in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. They have continued on because both the creators, the craftsmen, the potters, enjoy the challenge and the invitation to engage in figurative sculptural work with a pot, but also because they are of interest to buyers. People are interested in making them, and several South Carolina potters say that they continue to make face jugs because when people visit their showrooms, that's what they want to buy. So Clayton Bailey did make numerous face jugs, and here you can see one of them. We'll look at a few of them. There's a couple of devil jugs. Here's a two-face jug. And here's one of his devil jugs. So what Clayton said is face jugs and jug heads are an American ceramic tradition, and face jugs were first made in the early 1800s by slave potters and others in the Edgefield district of South Carolina. They turned jugs and cups on the potter's wheel and then modeled them into grotesque faces. Bits of porcelain or white rocks were used as eyes and teeth, and they usually had a pulled handle or two. Nothing is known of the purposes of these original face jugs. We've actually talked a little bit about possible functions and purposes. Only a few of them have been found, often in old cemeteries in the South, and since the 19th century, face jugs have been a sideline of many traditional American potters in the southeastern United States. Clayton Bailey also carries on the tradition when he makes these face jugs he calls jug heads, and skinheads and devil jugs and two-face jugs. He claims that having them around the studio makes him feel loved and admired by his jughead fans. Bailey's jug heads are all share one unique and original hidden feature. They all leak from their runny noses. Clayton Bailey was both a master artist and a court jester. Dearly missed. So we're going to look at another contemporary artist who makes face jugs, and these are the face jugs of Kemper Stone. And Kemper Stone is currently a student in this class and does enjoy making face jugs, and has for some years now, and I was quite pleased that he let me photograph some of them for you to see. And here are some of his face jugs, fired in our wood kiln. And Kemper stone has kept the tradition of very direct, vigorous, and kind of a simplified caricature kind of modeling to the face jugs. But he expresses a lot of a kind of personality that's unique to his work. They have a certain quality. You can see and hear this sort of somewhat perhaps disillusioned or disoriented or a little bit anxiety actually coming from this wonderful face jug. Here are some of the pieces that I have made over the past few years. These are very recent. As you can see, they're still green and unfired. This is one. And this is probably about 8 inches tall. Here's another view. And this is made from a method. This face jug is made by throwing the original pot and then applying the materials, just like they made them in Edgefield County in South Carolina. Throw them and then apply the materials onto them. And you can see that my approach is a little bit more sculptural. Here I'm trying to stick more closely to the kind of work being done in Edgefield. So just very direct modeling and very not overly worked, not overly realistic or naturalistic features, just very direct and again with the white clay for eyes and teeth. And this method, 2 slab discs are made. They're put over balls of newspaper to create a bowl-like shape. The bowls are joined at their edges, paddled into a ball, and then a spout is added on the top to create this form. And this is actually very close to in size to the almost 6 inches size of the original face jugs. Here is another variation. This one's more along the lines of 8 to 10 inches tall. More dramatic handle, more detail in the ears. But again, I'm using these as an invitation to play with sculptural ideas about the human face and about human expression. This is the other side of the piece. One last greenware piece, again thrown on the wheel and then sculpted. This is the other side of the piece. Here is something that I enjoy as well, and I've only done one of these so far, but this piece is quite large. It's approaching 40 inches tall. And so that becomes a whole different kind of activity, a major effort to create a sculptural form of this size. And though the eyes are quite deep and the nose is piercing in there, it will hold liquid all the way to the top. This is really an exciting form to have on this scale. But when you're starting to do this is a very contemporary approach to this idea, definitely attributing it to the tradition of face jugs, but at the same time recognizing that it owes as much to my own vision as a sculptor. And here are some more examples. This is made with the 2 slab disc approach. The 2 circular slab discs bowled and then attached at the rims. And as is this one. And these again are just under 6 inches along the lines of the traditional face jugs. These are more examples of the sculptural approach that I take. And this piece is approximately 20 inches tall. So we're far exceeding the tradition of face jugs, of traditional face jugs, and starting to just enjoy the sculptural possibilities of making a human face. Here's the front view. I think this one is called Big Smiley. Here again is another piece that is more in the almost 30 inches tall. And here's a front view of the piece. And one more example here, this one being called, I think it's called Chiclets. So as you start to engage in your making of face jugs, I think it's vital to be aware of its history and tradition and to feel a sense of appreciation and perhaps even gratitude for this idea that you can explore coming from the creativity of people probably suffering some of the most abject situations of our human history, and yet coming up with this wonderful creative expression, and we can participate in that, fully aware of that, and to engage and find our own expressions and our own ideas using this approach, and taking this idea and finding new expression for putting faces on pots. So I invite you to explore these possibilities and really see where it goes for you. We'll look at one last piece here, where the handles have gotten really quite exaggerated. And you can see that my sculptural approach here, and in many of these pieces, there's a kind of asymmetry and unexpected kind of response. So one side might be quite realistic, whereas the other side will start to take on more sculpturally abstract components, very similar to perhaps a sculpture by Henry Moore. You might see this kind of exaggeration or subtle suggestion of facial features.